From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Dan O'Brien commenting on the corn market's reluctance to rally as that derecho damage to the Corn Belt continues to be assessed. And Dan reports on the remarkably strong grain sorghum basis levels at Kansas delivery points during his weekly segment on the grain market trends. Also today, K-State's Terry Griffin and Gregg Ibendahl on a different approach to determining least-cost crop fertilizer options for you producers using an economic tool they've developed, now available to growers and retail fertilizer vendors alike. And awaiting with the latest on the Kansas agricultural weather scene, K-State's Mary Knapp. All that here on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Thanks for being along with us once more. Well, the grain markets are quite an intriguing thing to watch right now. We'll talk once more with grain market economist Dan O'Brien of K-State Research and Extension. Dan, to start with this, following last week's bullishness in the corn and bean markets, there's been something of a pause in those rallies this week. Is this just a matter of the market stopping for a moment and taking stock of where things are?
I think that there's uncertainty in terms of crop damage done to Iowa from the storm that needs to be digested. We have seen the corn market go from a low of about 308 thereabouts within the last 5-6 days up to a high of just over 330 on the September contract. The close for D's futures yesterday, 329.5. So the market has taken that, and you can see its judgment was that, in so many words, that the USDA's projection of 15.287 billion bushels will be pared down some, but on the low side, best pessimistic thoughts are 300 million, maybe 250. There's a lot of pessimism as to whether if that corn, even though it's flat, will ultimately cause that much of a challenge. Mm-hmm. And frankly, as you look at the USDA and the ag press of late, market analysts, the estimates range from 250 to 300 million on the low side to 500 million up to 7 or 8.
And we're talking about the damage to the Iowa corn crop from the derecho.
Iowa corn crop, and some, as you look at the track of that storm on weather maps, it did go some into Illinois. Just had a meeting of colleagues that work in both those states, virtual conference. We look at grain market things. And for both corn and soybeans, they're both pretty reticent to think that there's much impact. Now, I personally think that maybe they're too reticent. Corn that's laying down flat like that, stripped up soybeans, and especially now with when you look at the weather forecast in those areas and the amount of moisture we've had, person can see this on our notes we put together. When you look at the accumulated 7-day moisture, it is 0 in those areas.
And now, Iowa had drought concerns to begin with.
Iowa, last 30 days, Iowa is really the bullseye, but even over into the northern part of Illinois, you've got problems. I guess our Kansas experience kind of affects how I view crop recovery. When we get a problem in wheat, a freeze or something, and we think, oh, this could be terrible. Well, how many years, about half the time or more, we tend to get rainfall, cool temperatures, it all responds, and the key is no crop stress. Well, we bent this stuff over, and we're not getting more moisture. Now, you could argue, well, maybe it had moisture before, but just hear from people in that area, just differing stories. So I think that the market obviously has said, no big deal. We got enough corn. But we won't know until probably the September USDA crop production report, and that comes at about the end of that second week. They'll have people actually out in the fields on the first week in September, around September 1st. They'll have their own people doing plot measurements. But even with that, the USDA in their hesitancy may not, if there's something out there, they'll still forecast within a bound of uncertainty. We probably, as in so many of these stories, we won't know until October or later what the real size of that is. But whereas the market right now is pretty obvious, it's thinking this is no big deal, 200, 300 million bushels. The surprise would be if it went from 5 to 8 or more. And 200 million bushels, by estimates, about 5.8 million acres in Iowa is affected, thereabouts. There's some numbers out saying even more, but say 5.8 million acres, thereabouts. If that's 10 bushel an acre, well, that's 58 million bushels. If it's 100 bushel an acre, it's 580. And then it's a battle between the acres actually affected and the yield. Their projected yield for the state's 200. So 100 bushel an acre. Off of that's basically half down, with a bunch of zeros in those affected counties. So obviously I'm all fired up about this, but the overall market has said not a big deal. Well, we'll see if that ends up being a reasonable assumption or not.
Let's accentuate the positive, if we might, for a second here. As far as price action here in Kansas, you look at the basis for corn doing well, and for grain sorghum, absolutely on a hot streak here in this state.
Grain sorghum basis bids, again, based off these same futures, unbelievable. For instance, in Salina, we have a positive basis. This is off our Ag Manager basis tool. A person can go look at different locations around the state. Basis in Salina, about 70 cents over. And the next highest we'd had at any years back to and including 2016, grain sorghum was 40 cents under. So amazing differential. And that's really par for the course. And what gets your attention for those grain sorghum basis bids is their strong uptrend in Colby location we looked at, Garden City, Salina, still upwards, not quite as dramatic in Hutchinson, Topeka, shooting upwards pretty strong, even been strong staying there in Columbus. So grain sorghum, strong basis bids, signs that elevators anticipating export business going to continue. It's telling that when you look at the daily ethanol plant bids for feed grains, there is not a bid for grain sorghum listed for Kansas.
That's rare. That really is.
That really is. That just shows that the demand pull into the export market isn't leaving any oxygen, at least what we can see on yesterday for grain sorghum. Corn's not doing that bad either. You and I were talking before we went on the air. When you look at the ethanol plant bids across the United States and look at the Kansas corn bid, it's a range of from 5 under to 40 over. And on the top end, the next highest bid in the United States is 15 over. There was somebody who wrote a book. It was dealing with other things. Says, well, what's wrong with Kansas? But there's nothing wrong with Kansas if you're trying to sell corn to ethanol plants. This is a tremendous bid. And the basis bids, they differ regionally for corn. Corn, again, the Colby location, about 5-10 under. Next highest we've been at this time in recent years, about 35 under. Garden City, we're about 10 over. Next highest we'd seen at this time of year is about even basis. Salina, we're pretty strong, about 30 under, and we've been higher than that, so still decent, but not exceedingly strong. Hutchinson, the highest basis bid, about 5 under. In Atchison, trending upwards, but just more of an okay basis, kind of like Salina. But in Columbus, shooting higher, now at about 25 cents over. And the highest we'd seen back to and including 2016 was about 15 over. So we're bemoaning the futures, but the basis continues to be strong in Kansas for these feed grains in many locations. So just thought-provoking. I do want to mention some things happening on the export side. Right. Coming to the end of those old crop of the current marketing years for corn, sorghum, and for soybeans. And you're seeing some cancellations of old crop business rolling over into the new crop business. It's really interesting to see how much of the USDA's projection has been rolled into those new marketing years. For soybeans, USDA has projected about 2.1 billion bushels in exports, projected about 1.6 this year. So for next year, 2.125. Forward bids, 36% of that already out there. So that is pretty good. When you look at grain sorghum bids, are about 28% of forward bids into that next year. That's for 260 million bushels. We had 210 projected for last year. We're the one we're in now. And for corn, 22% of the way to 2.225 billion bushels. USDA's projection going to be about 1.75 or so. So higher exports and at least 22% up to 35% of the way there already. So there are things afoot in that market. China's a big part of it, but they're not the only one.
And so that would all come together to suggest that maybe there is some bullishness out there over the not too distant horizon for these markets.
I think so. And even for wheat, you look at all U.S. wheat exports, well, and we're 11 weeks into this marketing year, we're 42% of the way to the USDA's projection, 975 million. We're only 21% of the way to the marketing year. So that's good for all wheat. For hard red, we're 36% of the way there, again, for 21% of the year. So again, we're bemoaning the negativeness, but the low prices and the weakening U.S. dollar relative to some key currencies, it's helpful. I guess it's not showing up much in the futures markets, but again, the old adage, it's economically sound for theory, the best cure for low prices is low prices. So we got low prices, we got a lot of export business right now going on, and eventually that'll tend to bring demand up to the place where we whittle down stockpiles and get us out of this low price situation. Well, the speedier the recovery, the better in that respect. Dan, I would say amen to that.
Dan's notes on the markets, as always, are posted weekly on the agmanager.info website. Give those a glance, agmanager.info. Dan, we appreciate your time and your comments. Many thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
Dan O'Brien from his office in Colby, Northwest Kansas, grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. Agriculture Today returns after this over the K-State Radio Network.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State Research and Extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today is back now, and we're going to look further into this farm management matter, very important to you crop producers, and more so as we get into the fall, perhaps, as we consider the price trends for crop fertilizer. This was first brought to our attention by one of our guests here, Gregg Ibendahl, agricultural economist, K-State Research and Extension, just a couple of days back. We brought in as well Terry Griffin, precision agricultural economist, K-State Research and Extension, to talk of the difficulties in pricing fertilizer as one would consider the options availed to them. And Gregg, let you set the table here as to why this has become of interest lately.
Well, whenever you look at recommendations for nutrients on any kind of crop budget or what the agronomy folks would put out, they always recommend the amount of NP and K that you need to apply for on a particular crop acre. Well, unfortunately, you just can't go to your local co-op and say, I need X amount of NP and K, because there's usually some combination of those, especially for that middle ingredient, the P part of it. Because to get the P, you're going to have to either buy DAP or MAP, and that means you have 2 nutrients together, which makes pricing a little bit of a challenge.
And Terry, one of the methods of pricing and comparing products here has been to single out the nutrients that comprise that product and then try to attach a value to each of those nutrients. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the idea is, how can we mix these basic ingredients in a way that we arrive at the levels of nutrients, but at the minimum cost? And so this is one of the first uses of that mathematical process. It's probably near 100 years old. It's called linear programming. How do we get all the criteria at the minimum cost?
So we'll talk of how that works, but what is the issue with singling out nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium individually and comparing product to product along that line, Gregg?
Well, for the main thing is it's hard to come up with a single price for a single nutrient. So Terry has pointed out to me there's a couple of websites who are produced by like private contractors who do agronomy work, and they were saying you could price these fertilizers by like a DAP or MAP with the two, which is two nutrients together, that you could first price maybe like the nitrogen side, and then you could price the P from what's left over. Well, there's trouble with doing that because exactly what value of N would you put into that calculation to figure that out? That could make a big difference. And then there's a case like soybeans where you really only need the phosphorus part. You don't need the nitrogen. Well, if you're buying DAP or MAP, you get the nitrogen basically to come along with that. So really for soybean production, you probably wouldn't put a value on the nitrogen component as you would if you were applying that same product on, let's say, corn. So it makes it a little difficult. If you use that same procedure like you're going to use that stuff on corn and then go for soybeans, you're probably going to have the wrong price for the P component when you get done.
Can that difference be substantial enough to truly make it worthwhile for a producer to look in another direction as far as pricing then?
Well, this isn't necessarily a tool that a producer would be directly concerned with. It would be a tool used at the retail level where they mix the ingredients. But for the producer, it could lead to a difference in price that they pay for their fertility needs. But the tools that we're talking about, Gregg had developed a tool that's on agmanager.info. It's a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet that's downloadable. We have some other tools that are more sophisticated as well that is meant to be used by service providers and retailers of fertilizer.
And that's a tool that gives a more effective portrayal of what that minimum cost fertilizer would be? Yes.
And not only will it give the minimum cost, but will tell us what proportions of each of the raw ingredients, urea, MAP, DAP, and Gregg mentioned that, and potassium and so forth.
Yeah, there's an issue sometimes, if you follow these recommendations, again, from these third-party agronomists who I don't think were affiliated with any university, you will likely get the right answer, I would say maybe 90% of the time. But again, there's a pretty good window there where you would not get the right cost combination for the nutrients you need. And being a farmer is all about, making sure you don't make any mistakes and trying to, minimize your expenses as much as you can. So our technique that we have on our tools on our Ag Manager will give you the right answer every single time. Basically, you just check some boxes and put what your minimum requirement needs, and it will do the calculations kind of behind the scenes.
So it is user-friendly, which is all important to so many of us out there.
Yes, I would say very much so.
Upon developing this tool and testing it out, have either of you found that it shows advantages to any particular form of in-specific nitrogen when you look at anhydrous versus urea versus the DAP and MAP products which have some nitrogen element?
Well, I think as a rule of thumb, you can pretty much say that if you're just looking for nitrogen, anhydrous ammonia is probably going to be your cheapest cost for the basic raw nutrient. However, that may not necessarily be your cheapest option to actually use because there is an application rate that you have to use because normally you're going to be putting on the anhydrous probably as a separate application. So you need to really figure other ways or how you're going to get that nutrient actually on your field when you're looking at the total cost calculation.
And that was the next question. What about application costs? Because so far we're looking at product costs solely. Those application costs have to be factored in somehow, Terry, to arrive at a minimum utilization cost of fertilizer.
When we're using only dry products, we can assume that the application cost may not be directly relevant because we'll have to pay that regardless. But when we're looking at combinations of different passes of the field, one with dry, one with, let's say, anhydrous or even liquid, then that's when the application cost may make or break the decision on which set of fertilizer forms that are applied.
Mm-hmm. Will the tool account for that application cost?
Yes, in our Excel version, there is a place to put the application cost in there, so that would be included in the calculation there too.
All right. So it's useful in a variety of ways, this tool that's available to you producers. One more thing here that we could talk of, and that is how a producer factors in the likely nitrogen credit from soybeans if you're following that bean crop with, say, corn, grain sorghum. whatever it might be. That's getting into the agronomics to a certain extent, but can that be also included in the calculation? Terry?
It's implicitly there. Way that would work is the soil test results, or the agronomist will make a recommendation for NPK and so forth, and those recommended levels will be plugged into the model. So the credit for rotation with soybean and so forth would be accounted for before the data enters the model.
So the soil test will be the thing to rely on there, basically speaking.
Yep. None of that changes. These models are only intended to get the blend of fertilizer that minimizes cost but meets the criteria. And Gregg alluded to something else that I thought was really handy. And sometimes we don't want to overapply a certain nutrient, and Gregg mentioned nitrogen on soybean. Mm-hmm. And so there's not only minimum criteria, but there's also maximum criteria that Gregg's spreadsheet allows the user to enter.
So it's flexible. Well, Gregg, you were with us a couple of days back sharing your message that was passed along at that Risk and Profit conference, and you talked at that time about your expectations for fertilizer prices to decline as we get deeper into the year, saying that it still remains important for producers to pursue that minimum cost fertilizer?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of times, fertilizer makes up about 20% of our typical crop acre expense. So that's a pretty good chunk of money that most farmers are spending out for fertilizer. So, we need to look at fertilizer as a way to, to get the lowest cost we can, although I think sometimes producers look at fertilizer as a way to maybe help balance our cash flow from year to year. So, like I mentioned before, that if you're having you expect to have pretty good net farm income in the current year, you may buy your fertilizer for next year, this year, just to help lower what your net farm income is by raising your expenses up, and vice versa. If you think of this year especially, which is going to probably be a lower net farm income a year, you may want to hold off and buy your expenses in the spring to help balance out net farm income. But I wouldn't necessarily follow that when it comes to fertilizer, because I think we're going to come to a point this year, probably late fall, early winter, maybe midwinter, when we're going to probably reach our minimum price for a lot of the nitrogen products based on what the oil price is. And then I think they're going to start going up after that. Now, what I'm concerned about going forward is that when the economy recovers, because what we've done to the oil markets here from fracking, that we will see a gigantic rise in the price of oil, which will translate to much higher nitrogen prices. So at some point in the time, if oil gets up to be over $100 a barrel, then you're talking pretty high anhydrous prices. And I think farmers want to buy their fertilizer before that kind of thing happens. Again, that could be 2 or 3 years down the road, but I think it is coming.
And Terry, producers once more can find this tool at agmanager.info readily.
It's readily available as a quick download. We also have a few more that we're developing. We have a new site on Ag Manager that has recently been created. It's called Shiny, and it has some applications that were built using Shiny, which is an interactive graphing and mapping tool. And we have a fertilized blend tool for educational purposes that will be available in Shiny as well.
Very well. Explore all of that, producers, at agmanager.info. It can be plugged handily into your overall crop management. A large part of that has to do with how you deal with your fertilizer expenses. As is said here by Gregg, 20% of the crop budget normally every year. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us once again. We always appreciate your time and your input.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Eric. It's great to be here.
Agricultural economists with K-State Research and Extension, Gregg Ibendahl and Terry Griffin, on seeking that minimum cost of fertilizer for your cropping needs as we look forward. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We'll be back on the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And next up for you, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. China and the U.S. will hold trade talks on the status of the Phase 1 agreement between the two countries in the coming days. That's according to Chinese Commerce Ministry spokesperson Zhao Feng. He made those remarks during a briefing, but didn't offer any details except to say that both parties have agreed to hold a call, as he put it, in the near future. Meanwhile, White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows said this week that U.S. Trade Ambassador Robert Lighthizer continues to have discussions with his Chinese counterparts involving purchases and fulfilling their agreements. This comes as White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro acknowledged that China's stepped-up purchases of U.S. farm products are part of the commitments made under the Phase 1 trade deal. Chinese ambassador to the U.S., Chi Tiankai, said at a Brookings Institution event last week that the U.S. needed to make decisions on bringing bilateral ties between the two countries back to a normal track. The USDA has released new rules on payment limits and payment eligibility to reflect updated provisions in the 2018 Farm Bill. These actions include that USDA may approve a waiver of the average adjusted gross income limitation for participants of certain conservation contracts administered by the Farm Service Agency and the Natural Resources Conservation Service on environmentally sensitive land. Also, the mandatory changes expand the definition of family member to include first cousins, nieces, and nephews. The Office of Management and Budget completed its review of the USDA plan back in July. The final rule is published in today's Federal Register, and it became effective yesterday. And the USDA now has a new method to repel deer at night, and it's not like the others already out there. Here's more from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA researchers have developed a way to prevent deer vehicle collisions that differs from current methods.
Most of the mitigation methods that are used currently are based on the road rather than on the vehicle. So these are things like fences and crossing structures like overpasses and underpasses, vegetation management along the road, speed limits.
Travis DeVault is a senior research scientist at the University of Georgia. He says the problem with these efforts is that they are not always in the right place at the right time.
The advantages to a vehicle-based system is that they're always in the right place. They're on the vehicles.
USDA researchers recently applied for a patent for a new vehicle-based lighting system to help reduce the number of collisions during low-light conditions.
We're at the stage right now where the patent application has been submitted. We're looking for partners to license the patent and begin producing the product and selling the product.
That was Wildlife Services Technology Transfer Program Manager John Eisman. The product he referred to is a light bar that goes across the front of a vehicle, which makes it appear larger to a deer.
It is simple and straightforward, but we've actually done the research to show that it works. And so we've got good, strong data to show that this technology does work.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And yesterday, the National FFA organization announced a record-high student membership of 760,113. That's an increase from last year's 700,170 members. The top 5 student membership states are Texas, California, Georgia, Florida, and Oklahoma. Interestingly, FFA chapters can now be found in 24 of the 25 largest cities in the United States. Well, choosing wheat varieties for planting this fall requires careful study of the variety information available to you producers. As to what a grower should emphasize in this process, Kansas State University has just come out with some helpful guidelines. Marcia Boswell tells more about that on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
In recent years, wheat producers are faced with an increasing number of varieties from which to choose. Producers can use different tools and publications to study each variety's strengths and weaknesses, selecting varieties that best match their needs. Kansas State University Department of Agronomy recently released a list of steps to making a better decision when selecting a wheat variety. They recommend selecting several varieties that are adapted to your region, then narrowing down the list to a few good candidates based on your production system, the variety's tolerance to abiotic factors, and maturity. Finally, they provide a list of resources to help you walk through each variety's characteristics. Regardless of whether you intend to plant one variety or several on your farm, it is important to start out with a list of several good candidate varieties. The final product of interest is grain yield, and therefore it's crucial to select varieties that have shown consistent performance and excellent yield record in the region. Varieties that have worked well for you and your neighbors in the past should be considered, but also make sure and check yield results from nearby K-State and other universities' variety performance tests and demonstration plots. Beyond looking at results from more than a single year, checking for variety performance in several nearby locations is also a good practice. A few great resources to consult are K-State Variety Performance Tests, OSU Variety Performance Tests, and the Colorado Wheat Variety Database. After selecting several varieties that have shown good adaptability and stability in your region, the list needs to be narrowed down to the number of varieties you intend to plant. Ideally, at least 2 or 3 varieties or a blend of 2 or 3 varieties should be planted to spread the risk on your acres. Select varieties that are adapted and resistant or tolerant to the major concerns in your region, but that have contrasting characteristics such as different maturities or disease resistance characteristics. This will help buffer the risk of a single event compromising production of the whole operation and can help spread out the harvest dates so not all varieties are ready at the same time. Some factors to consider include production system, tolerance to abiotic factors such as acid soils and drought, disease resistance, such as varieties with good stripe rust and leaf rust resistances, and varieties with resistance to viral diseases, such as wheat streak mosaic and barley yellow dwarf, or fungal diseases such as fusarium head blight. If these diseases are common concerns in your region, evaluate each variety's ratings against these constraints and select the ones that provide better levels of resistance. Finally, consider the variety's maturity. Selecting several varieties with differing maturities is a great tool to spread risk as well to optimize harvest timing. A link to the full article and resources is available at kswheat.com. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. K-State's Mary Knapp and the latest Kansas agricultural weather outlook are next here on Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Agriculture Today closes out now on Kansas agricultural weather. Across the way once more is climatologist Mary Knapp of K-State Research and Extension. Mary, now we're in a period of what's approaching extended dryness in Kansas, and that's becoming more worrisome for producers and others.
Right. When we look at the precip that we had over the last week, the Northwest saw the bulk of that moisture, and they were only 97% of normal. Everyone else had less than that. We had accompanying fairly cool temperatures, a little bit on the cold side, so the impact on our drought monitor was not as dire as it could have been. There was actually some improvement on the U.S. drought monitor in southeast Kansas on the western side of that as they analyzed that moisture that fell at the end of our last week's period. They saw a little bit more down there and allowed for some improvement. But for most of the state, it held status quo. We still have the moderate to severe drought lining western Kansas along the Colorado border and a larger area of moderate drought in southeast Kansas where the rains basically shut off after May and haven't really been sufficient for major improvement in the area.
We could stand for some moisture relief soon. We'll talk about the prospects or the lack thereof this coming week. You mentioned the mild temperatures, and we've enjoyed a couple of weeks now of conditions more reminiscent of mid to late September than August.
Right. It has been a very nice foretaste of what our falls typically are, which is mild days, temperatures in the upper 80s to low 90s, and then nighttime temperatures dropping into the 50s and 60s. And that is also signaling some lower humidities than we had seen through most of July. So that has been a very comfortable pattern for us. Still warm enough that we're getting those heat unit accumulation for our summer crops, particularly the soybeans and the sorghum, but not so oppressive that it's causing stress on the livestock. And so it's been, aside from the lack of moisture, fairly idyllic conditions. And it looks like that in our next week, we're going to see a little bit closer shift to our normal temperatures, a little bit warmer for both the daytime highs and the nighttime lows. We should note that when we talk about those milder temperatures, that did not mean that we didn't hit the century mark. Again, out in the western parts of the state, they did see some temperatures reach as high as 103, not nearly so hot as what is being experienced in the desert Southwest with that 130-degree reading in Death Valley.
Don't want any part of that.
Yeah, we don't want any of that. But again, the nighttime temperatures dropped off very nicely into the mid-50s out there, so very comfortable conditions as we enter into what will be the beginning of our fall season.
And those nighttime temperatures next week, again, in the 60-degree range. So not looking at a severe impact on livestock as we often see in midsummer with 70-degree readings plus.
Right. When we keep our nighttime temperatures in the low to mid-70s, that is a signal that our humidity levels are fairly elevated, and that is stressful for livestock, particularly if they're in a confined operation. When those temperatures drop down into the 60s, even though the daytime temperatures are still warm, it provides a point of relief, and the livestock can fare much better, have less stress on that. And the crops, for that matter, need to have those changes in temperature to be most efficient at their photosynthetic activity. So having those nighttime lows drop down is helpful for the reproductive phases of our various summer crops, particularly soybeans. Our only concern now is that we need to have some moisture to finish off these crops and also to prepare the soils for our upcoming fall planted winter wheat and canola.
But you say we'll have to look beyond next week for that moisture.
Right. As we look at the quantitative precip forecast for the next week, at best, they're looking at 1/10 of an inch of precipitation in various spots across the state. Much of the state is expected to see less than 1/10 of an inch, which will be well below what we would typically see in a week. We're watching a couple of tropical depressions that may escalate into hurricanes. One is expected to go up along the East Coast, and we won't see much impact from that. But a second one is expected to make landfall along the Gulf Coast between Texas and Louisiana. And that has a better chance for some of that moisture to make its way up into the Central Plains. And we'll just have to see how that develops as it progresses. There are another series of storms that are still out in the Atlantic that also may contribute as we go into our late summer, early fall time period.
But those are always wild cards.
Right. Those are definitely wild cards, not anything that we can plan on having an impact from it.
And the outlooks for September and the updated 3-month outlook are both posted now. And they're suggesting what?
Well, basically, they're suggesting that we will continue a fall, which would be the September, October, November time period, of warmer than normal temperatures and a slight chance for wetter conditions in the eastern third of the state and drier conditions in the western third of the state. But those probabilities are fairly low, so it may very well be that we have a typical fall pattern. As we look at September, that is tilted towards warmer and drier for the entire state. Again, September is when we start thinking of getting that winter wheat in the ground. A dry September doesn't favor a good establishment for that winter wheat. But it only takes one storm to move through and make that change. You can look at 2018. Overall, September was dry, but we had two very nice storms split in the month that set the stage for the very wet 2019.
Timing is everything. Mary, thank you. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, Eric. You as well.
Mary Knapp, along with us each Friday to talk Kansas agricultural weather, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. And thanks to you as well for joining us. Please be back with us on Monday. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good weekend for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.